Do you know how to tell the difference between a plant that has been eaten by a small buck versus a big buck?
Nope.
Little tree nipped off, little buck. Big tree nipped off, big buck.
I did not know that. Also, you said you can just tell by the nips.
All right, so a question we get all the time is, what do deer eat? What are they eating right now? What are they eating in October? What are they eating in November? And I don't know how you feel, Tony, but I think the answer most of the time is just, it depends, right?
Well, certainly it does, but it's also just a fundamental question that every deer hunter asks. And we look at man-made food and we go, oh, my food plot, the cornfield, alfalfa, soybeans. But when you get past those, kind of the greens and the grains and get to the natural food that's out there, the answer to that question is way more complicated than people think.
Yeah, so if we're talking categories of food that deer are going to focus on, there are the man-made crops that you talked about, food plots, corn, alfalfa, soybeans, depending on the region, lots of different things. Then you've got the natural browse, bushes, shrubs, grasses, things like that. And then you have hard and soft mass. So right. That is stuff like acorns falling out of the trees, apples, persimmons, different things like that. And I think an important thing to note, and something I think we should talk about here, is the time of year that these different food sources become attractive. Because I think that question, what are deer eating now, or what do deer eat, depends on if you're asking that in August or October or March, whatever it is. So let's look at a couple examples. Like right here, we're in a food plot, and there's clover in here. There are some blades of rye in here, and this young green growth is something that deer are going to feed on early, or they will feed on it later in the fall too, as long as it's young, lush, still palatable to them. The crop fields, that's going to differ by year too. Like corn, from my experience, once it dries down in that late September time period, as they need more carbohydrates, they're going to feed on those grains more. Soybeans, the leaves are attractive in the summer. The beans themselves, once you get a good hard frost later into the season. One thing that's important, and then I'll let you tell me what you think about this, but I think there's one thing in understanding what deer eat hypothetically, or like I know they should be eating this right now, but it's another to actually confirm it, right? Going in there and scouting and seeing. So for me, like in a place like this, I want to see two things to help me decide whether deer are actually eating this now. I want to see actual sign of browsing, like nipped off blades of grass. You can see some in here that almost look like they were scissors, just cutting the tops of these blades. Unnipped on one here, or a nipped on one there. Or the same thing with a piece of clover, they'll nip off that top and you'll just see a little stalk. I want to see that, and then I want to see droppings. Ideally, lots of fresh droppings in an area will tell you that yes, deer have been feeding in here recently, and that's an important piece of the puzzle.
Yep. And that one of the things that we should talk about with that is the reason that you want to be able to identify what they're on now is because even when you were just talking a little bit ago and you're like, okay, corn, most attractive at this time. People think about October, that corn gets cut cornfield, all the deer are going to go out there. But there's a milky stage, the end of August, September, where if you glass a lot, you hunt bears, you'll see the animals really key on it for a short window.
Yeah.
And that's the lesson there. Same thing with soybeans. If you've got green soybeans into your season, the deer are going to be all over it, and they're going to turn yellow, and you might not see, the activity level. Then they'll dry up, and they might get really good again.
Yeah.
And so all of these food sources, we think of them as, your food plot's a destination food source, right? But there are times when they're going to want to be there, and there are times when the most beautiful lush food plot can't outcompete the acorns that are dropping, or the persimmons that are ripe, or whatever. And so being able to identify when they're on it now is a skill that I think a lot of hunters kind of miss out on. Everybody kind of knows where deer are going to go, maybe end up in the evening to feed, but there's so much variability on what they're actually going to focus on day to day and week to week in your season. And if you can't figure out what they're on, you're going to default to that field edge stand over and over. You're going to overhunt your food plot. without being on something that could put you on an amazing pattern for 3 days or 5 days and then be gone.
Two perfect examples here of mast producing trees, 2 white oaks. I have frequently seen deer come walk out of this woods looking like they're gonna come to the food plot, and instead stop underneath the trees, feed on acorns. So I think it's another important example of checking and seeing like what are they feeding on right now. And oftentimes that's mast. It's not the sexy crops, farm fields, that kind of stuff. It might be trees.
Yeah. And the lesson there, you see this a lot when you glass in the summer, especially you glass a bean field or an alfalfa field, watch those bachelor groups, bucks come out, and all of a sudden, you know, they're out there for 10, 15 minutes, and they go right back into the woods. And you know, when you walk through the woods that time of year, you're like, there's bugs everywhere, stinging nettles, why are they there? But they're browsing on something, they come out and eat. And so a lot of times people would look at this and go, well, I have my food plot, this is good enough, I'm gonna sit over there, and all of a sudden you have one tree, one oak tree that's, you know, just happens to be a white oak that's dropping the filet mignon acorns on the deer, and they go, I'd rather be here. And there's so many examples of hard mast and soft mast that matter to deer in the moment. You have to learn your local food sources and when they come on and when they're no good.
And the only way to figure that out is to see it with your own eyes.
Right.
So you gotta get out there and, like in this case, walk around in September, see what they're feeding on, and look and find the acorn caps, find the fresh droppings, hopefully, see things that confirm for you, oh yes, there are deer in here right now. And then you can write that down for future reference. Okay, this time period, they're feeding on these oaks. They were feeding on this kind of native browse. A key thing to remember, especially with mast, is it's not guaranteed every year, right? Different conditions, different cycles for these trees. There might be every other year a red oak tree that produces a lot, and then every 3 or 4 years the white oaks hit. But it's not always gonna happen. So you need to maybe go into it every single year hoping for that production, but you need to check it.
You know, the thing that differentiates good hunters from great hunters a lot of times, one of the key factors is if somebody can get on a browse pattern and kill a deer, they're tuned into the woods. Like there's woodsmanship there because it's just not as obvious. I think that's one of the hardest food patterns to get on, but it's also kind of the most necessary in places where deer are gonna browse. Like if you think about big woods, you know, whitetails up north, down south, you know, they might not have a cornfield anywhere near them. They might not have a lot for mast, but they might have forestry, timber. And so you get some trees cut down, you get some new shoots coming up, or you get one section cut away, clear cut, and then you've got old growth next to it. So you've got that edge, hard edge they're gonna travel because they like them, but also just that fresh growth, and it offers them something different. And when I don't know about you, but for me, when I find a browse pattern, it usually goes one of 2 ways. I'm walking in looking for something else and I see all this nipped off, you know, tops to whatever that's growing up, or most of the time I'm sitting in a tree and I'm like, why are all the deer walking through there? And it looks like they're picking here and they're picking there, but there's like a general direction, they're holding to something, and that can be a real difference maker in some of the places that I think are just hard to hunt. Like some of those environments where you're low deer density, high predators, browse is huge.
Yeah, I think a key thing with that, like there's too many different types of plants out here in any landscape that deer will naturally feed on for me to list them all, right? We can't sit here and list every different species because there's so many in one location, let alone in all the different locations that deer live. What you can, I think, do is look for basic patterns that will point you in the right place. Like one thing, if there's sunlight getting to the ground somewhere, especially that's surrounded by areas there's not sunlight, so if you're in a forest and then there's an opening in the forest and a bunch of sunlight getting down, you probably have some very attractive browse. Any kind of edge like you talked about, where there is that sunlight, where there's that thicker cover next to something different, likely gonna be some browse happening there. And then finally, like this maybe is the theme of the entire conversation, you gotta go in there and actually look for the sign that it's happening. I can't guarantee you that an azalea or whatever bush or whatever rose this or whatever, right? There's too many different things. I couldn't tell you that specific thing is gonna be very attractive on November 1st. But if we go walking through here, and like you said, we see the nips, we see the fresh droppings, we see a lot of recent tracks around that, you can then all of a sudden, okay, that's what's going on now. How do I key in on that? Yep. And that's kind of the name of the game when it comes to figuring out what are deer eating and what are they eating now? Well, it depends. You gotta go figure it out yourself.